Welcome, everybody. I'm really glad folks could show up. I'm really excited about this. My name is Ben Sigelman. I'm one of the co-founders at Lightstep, and I'm really pleased to be here with Heinrich Hartmann, who is a long-time customer of Lightstep, a principal engineer at Zalando, and actually formerly part of the reason that I wanted to have this conversation with Heinrich is that he spent many years in the vendor side actually at Celonis, which is a pretty scaled out TSDB metrics monitoring provider. And so he knows the space really, really well. And I think it'll be a fun conversation. So you'll be very happy to know that this is my only slide. I will I think we can just kind of get right to it. Heinrich, thank you so much for joining us. I gave the ultra brief intro. Do you want to say a few words about your background just before we get into the meat of it?
Yes, sure. And let me start by saying how happy I am to be here. Thank you very much for having me. This is great. Just a little bit about myself. I actually started out as a pure mathematician. For a long while, I thought I would earn a living sometime with this, but it didn't turn out that well. And then I kind of I went into IT, and then I discovered there are so many unsolved problems at the very fundamental layers, at the operating systems, at the just operations of things. So I basically got stuck there. And I was working like for 5 years as data scientist, and for the monitoring vendor Sigelman, as you described, very metrics focused, very high scale. And then I switched to Zalando, a European e-commerce platform, as a principal engineer. Since a little while, I'm also head of engineering in the SRE department. So right now, trying to figure out how we can provide the best observability for Zalando and the larger organization.
I've got to ask about being a mathematician. Do you feel that informs your work on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis?
Informs, I think, too much, but there are certain skills which are very valuable to take over, which is like just no fear of equations and kind of like ways to dig through math-heavy things, also on the operations side, like graphs and forecasting and all that. But the core skill I found that helps me currently most is actually writing. Just to be able to write larger documents and having written journal articles and stuff like that. So funny enough, once you are in the management chain, you will write much more documents than you write code. So this is maybe the most tangible outcome from that kind of education.
Well, documents are a step up from PowerPoint. So I think you still have some there's still ways to fall below writing long documents. Okay, thank you for the background. And then, I mean, I think anyone who has done any kind of online shopping in EMEA or other regions will know Zalando, but for the American audience, it's less known. Can you talk a little bit about Zalando, the scale of the business, that sort of thing, just for context?
Yeah, sure. So Zalando is a fashion platform, e-commerce. They are the largest in Europe. I looked up the numbers on the internet, so I don't say anything wrong. So we have around 50 million customers currently across 23 countries. Annual revenue just surpassed 10 billion. So it's quite a bit. We do have our own logistics, which is responsible for the majority of our workforce. We have over 17,000 employees currently, but around 2,500 software engineers on staff. So organization is relatively large, and I myself am part of a business unit called Builder Infrastructure. We are basically like providing a platform for our builders to build the fashion store platform and also multiple other products which are hosted on the same substrate. And we are trying to provide a general platform for observability, for just infrastructure running Kubernetes clusters. Also some managed services, Postgres, Kafka, and data tooling, Spark cluster, stuff like that. So there's basically a whole business unit that is providing that. And for most of my time, I can just pretend I'm an infrastructure provider. And often I don't really have to think so much about the fashion aspects of the whole thing.
Yeah, and someone in chat said that you maintain more than 150 Kubernetes clusters. Is that accurate? Are you allowed to talk about that?
Yeah. So we segregate our Kubernetes by teams. So for every team that we actually have two Kubernetes clusters, a test cluster and a production cluster. And we have actually two AWS accounts. So we have a very, very large number of clusters, but also then again, also large numbers of pods and nodes that are backing that. And yeah, this is also centrally provided. So all the bootstrapping of those clusters, it's all automated. So it can be managed as a relatively seen as a single service. But operational wise, there are some benefits of having it spread out like that. And as far as I can tell, it's working quite good.
Yeah. And what's are you able to speak about the scope of the system in terms of just, the number of microservices?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, maybe the footprint AWS wise, I think we are up to 10,000 nodes in some cases, just the raw EC2 footprint that we have. We already talked about the Kubernetes clusters, 200 of them. There's, I think, more than 10,000 applications that are currently running at Zalando. I think in Lightstep, we see something above 3,000. So it's yeah, every day there's new applications coming and going. So it's not like you can know at every time something like what the application landscapes looks like. And maybe talk about this 2 or 3 years back when we still do it architecture reviews with post-its. You had this gigantic walls just to trying to understand the services that were involved with the just basic operations that are key to the business. So it's highly distributed, it's highly decoupled to give the teams a lot of autonomy. We recently tried to standardize on the tech a little bit more. So there was a time we called the Wild West, where just every team was free to pick arbitrary names and arbitrary tech, and everybody could do the fancy stuff. Now we learned it's kind of dangerous as a company to be that free with internal policies. So we are more conservative and more guidelines around the tech and how we build applications to leverage more standardization. But it's still pretty vast. It's still so vast that you cannot really understand as a platform provider what you're doing. So everything you have to do is around products, about catering to large audiences. And for most of the time, I also feel like a little bit of a vendor inside the company who is reselling and repackaging some of the products that you build. And certainly having that vendor background is also helping with our understanding between our two parties, and also with the mindset we have internally for our internal customers.
Yeah, I think something you said there about the Wild West, that really resonates with the conversations I've had with lots of different customers and prospects out there, and that there's a temptation with the move to microservices and cloud native to say, oh, wow, we're trying to enable the individual teams to innovate on their own. And there is some truth to that. That's part of the point of it, right? You have these different services. You're calling them applications, but I think what you mean by that is a microservice that's part of a larger whole. Is that correct?
Exactly.
So, I mean, if you have your service, it does make sense to allow the development team to have their own software development lifecycle around that service and to innovate quickly. But if you allow them full freedom of movement to pick their entire technology stack, it's a total catastrophe, every time, right? You have no way to leverage. There's no amortization of any of the kind of complexity of monitoring or security or CI/CD or whatever, unless you can enforce at best a paved. I mean, if you can't get down to a single thing, at least there's a clear paved path of this is what you should do if you want it to be easy. But yeah, that I've seen that many times, the evolution take place. And I think observability is an area where that's particularly important, because you really can't be hopping from tool to tool as you're trying to navigate one of these larger applications. Okay, and then the last thing I question, really, this is somewhat ignorant on my part, but I mean, I think of e-commerce as being a very competitive, low margin industry. I don't know how much that filters into your world, but is that something you can speak about? I mean, just the pressures on costs and so on.
There's definitely pressure on costs. I mean, we all know about the economic environment, and also we are not purely a software business, so we are not dependent on the AWS costs alone. It's also operating large warehouses is a whole different game you're playing, which has become more difficult. But yeah, I think Zalando understands itself still as a high growth company who is like trying to grow larger and grab larger bits of the market. So I wouldn't say that we are operating under extreme cost pressures, but it's definitely something that that is a concern. I would say that with telemetry, we have a history of operating on a very slim margin, or very highly cost efficient, since we built so much telemetry tooling in-house, and we're able to optimize for our workloads and the needs, or just arrived at a setup which was comparatively cost efficient. And I just hear numbers that other people are throwing out. So we had a metric system which we built ourselves, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit later. Which we built in-house based on Cassandra. And yeah, I mean, it's not the prettiest thing you have seen, but it has been quite cost efficient. And so, yeah, I mean, this is, I think, how much I can say about the costs without going into much details.
Sense. Yeah, and I will also say, since I don't want you to make you say this, that Zalando has been very impressive to work with, and that the organization in general, especially the SRE organization that Lightstep has been interfacing with most directly, is very well organized and able to actually affect change at large scale across the organization, which has made the partnership really fun for Lightstep. And we've learned a lot from the way Zalando has done things, actually. I think there are many areas where Zalando has been quite innovative, and we've learned a lot just watching Zalando in the way that you all have been operating over the last many years. So it's been a pleasure to work with you. So I want to, first of all, I want to say for folks who are on the chat, so that's sort of background Zalando and the infrastructure. We're going to start talking about observability, talk about metrics specifically, deep dive into a couple of, kind of key moments in, Zalando's year from a load standpoint and things like that. But if people have questions, you should drop them into the chat or into the Q&A feature, and I'll try to keep an eye on that as well. And ideally this can be pretty interactive if there's anything you want to hear more about. So that said, Heinrich, I'd like to dive into the observability side. Can you just talk a bit about your, I think it's obvious in the context here that Lightstep is your observability provider, but can you talk about what the core use cases are for observability at Zalando, and what you use Lightstep for today?
Sure, but let me approach it actually from the organizational change angle, which I think it's bringing the most light into it. So back in 2018, when our journey together started, Zalando was in this Wild West area. We had this monolith. It was kind of dissolved into microservices. We were doing the hip things. We had some container runtime on Kubernetes, on AWS before there was Kubernetes. So had some of the large scale effects and feeling that early. And our production incidents were becoming more and more tricky. We were burning out a lot of on-call responders. We had a lot of blaming inside the incident process. So we have tens of teams really trying to figure out who is actually the problem, who is to blame. My service is fine, my dashboards look green. And I mean, it was effective in the sense that we got things going, but it was just very, very high effort and high MTTR and high burnout on the on-call responders. So it was a very difficult time. And back in the day, the SRE crew, I was not part of it, but I've heard many stories where just desperate for finding a better way of doing it. And at SRECon, or at the conferences they attained, they realized that tracing could really make a difference here and could be one of the paths forward. And we were one of the early partners with Lightstep in 2018 and 19 to adopt telemetry, open tracing, and go all in with that and really try to run operations at Zalando with tracing. And that has been a huge success. It has been a journey. And you said this kind of ability to inflict organizational changes here, I think, really key. Adopting tracing is not an easy feat. It's a multi-year investment that you need to make to kind of evangelize inside the organization, to educate people about the benefits, to demonstrate the benefits, to make it easy to adopt, to have the libraries there, to maybe make a PR at a key service and say, hey, let's do it this way. But if you are going through that, the benefits which you get at the end really paid off for ourselves. So main problems were with MTTR and performance. Actually, back in the day, there were quite a few performance problems which are impossible to debug and just like painful. Right now, Zalando is at the top of the charts when it comes to web performance and mobile performance, very, very strong. I think there are a lot of efforts in addition to tracing, but it has been instrumental in eliminating latency in the microservice backends. And for incident response, I think it's indispensable. I myself am incident commander. I'm looking into this global incidents. I have no idea what all the services are. I have no idea about them. Just learning it as I'm in those incidents. And the number one telemetry provider that we use to look into that is always tracing. And the amount of information you can grasp, even as a relatively outsider of that situation, and pinpoint, it's this application. This is where the errors come from, is very much enabling. And something like, I cannot really imagine how I would debug these situations at Zalando without having tracing available. It sounds like nightmarish to me. So it's definitely key in that regard. And one thing that Zalando is really proud of, Zalando SRE, is that they have been able to innovate still in the SLO and the alerting space on top of tracing. So tracing is one of the key technologies or key data sources that allow you to really understand your landscape and the interactions between your services well. And I mean, you understand that better as anybody else, but for us, it was cool to see, hey, this kind of root cause analysis was always very mechanical. We're just like looking for the errors and the spans, and then we automated that. So we have this adaptive paging technology, which allows you to like set an SLO, and then the team gets paged that is closest to the root cause. That has been this is basically running on alerting on the core UX of the shop, and people are relying more and more on this. All the major services are alerted more or less, like relying on this kind of alerting enabled by tracing. So it's another big win, I think, a little bit further down the road with most of the observability journeys, but something that we see as key, enable innovation in that space, and also very much looking forward to more innovation that comes out of your company. Performance I talked about. There's also cost aspects of it. For sure is when it comes to log volume, this has always been like a pain point. Everybody knows that logs are quite expensive. Our current policy within Zalando is that everything that takes place within a transaction should not be a log, it should be a span log. So it's instead of just logger.log, it's like span.log. Code-wise, not that big of a difference, but usually it's exactly what you want. You want to have that log line in the context of the span, so you have it available in the traces. You don't need the big tail of everything that is in there. And that is going well, has allowed us to reduce costs quite a bit already. We still are on that path. There are some areas around like high latency batch jobs that I still think are best covered with logs. So the use case will not completely go away, but it's more like the niche cases that we still want to use logs. And so that's definitely one thing. And the other reduction is also in the use of metrics. I mean, we are very, very heavy metric users still, but we don't do so much red metrics. I mean, everybody preaches use metrics for resources and red metrics for your applications. But with tracing, you actually have the data already. And we do actually run without sampling the whole tracing system, which is quite amazing. I thought people were crazy when I learned that we are actually doing it. And I'm still surprised of how this is possible to a certain degree. But at this point, we are pushing something like close to 10 million spans a second into Lightstep every second, like petabytes a day. And we are not breaking the bank on it, which is like a little bit surprising, but it allows us to have really high precision data on all of our operations with really high slice and dicing capabilities to look into our workloads on certain APIs. So that value we are getting out of the tracing product is really high and something that is really core to our observability, like internal product that we're offering. It's all about tracing.
Thank you. So I've got a couple of follow-ups, and there's some good questions in the chat. One of the questions from the beginning of your talk track there is whether it's difficult to debug microservices. And I think I'd imagine I'll let you confirm this, but that it's it's never easy, right? But that went from being extremely difficult to being feasible, but through the introduction of, Lightstep for tracing. Is that fair? I mean, I'm just based on what you've said before, but.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, you still need to have domain experts available to dive deep. I mean, there's this kind of promise of observability being that about the unknown unknowns, and you can drive arbitrarily deep into systems. I don't really see that. I think there are always barriers until you go, but at least stuff like which application is responsible for this on a very high level, what's going on. I mean, if you have a large, like sometimes our interactions on the user level have like 700 spans in them, and then you really can understand which part of the systems we're failing, for how long they were pending, if there are like weird configurations with spans. So you usually, even for an external, get a good idea of like, what is the high level problem, what is the query that is slow, or the thing that is failing, and like pinpointing, identifying the team which can help with that kind of problem is something that even an external can do. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, how much you are able to dig into the internals and really root cause the problem, this is then something that depends on your level of instrumentation, the quality of instrumentation there, and your experience with the service. But there we rely on the domain experts to do that, and usually, hopefully, they're able to do this well.
Yeah, and then on logging specifically, I mean, I hear this all the time, right? And I mean, for logging, I feel like it's one of these "don't hate the player, hate the game" things. It's like there's nothing totally wrong with logging; it just wasn't meant for this, right? I think, and what Zalando has done, which is basically to say, if it's a log about a transaction, that belongs on the trace, not in your logging system. That's, in my mind, the simplest answer for improving the ROI case for logging. It still is valuable to have, one log line per transaction at the top of the stack to do various BI and security things. And you still need to have logs, as you said, for certain esoteric use cases, or to, talk about other things happening in the infrastructure. But having a log by every transaction in every service is totally unsustainable when you're adding hundreds or thousands of services. It just doesn't make sense from an ROI standpoint. So, I mean, how much are you able to talk about the degree of log reduction that you've achieved through this, or is that not something you can talk about?
I would say it's easily in hundreds of thousands, maybe in the millions, but I can't really tell from, like, I don't have a baseline. So we are still looking to decrease it. But I mean, if you don't have tracing, you have to use logs for an awful lot of things. And if you are extrapolating that, then it gets like very easily into the millions. But I mean, the concrete cost reduction projects that you're running, trying to find the highest volume log lines that are costing you the most are usually not that expensive.
Yeah, and there's a question: how do you standardize span attributes across 10,000 applications such that they're useful with an instance? Can you speak about that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is a little bit like wider than just Zalando, and has been recognized in the industry. And in the OpenTelemetry days, there were already semantic specifications, and now that everybody is using and gearing towards OpenTelemetry, the semantic specifications of these attributes become even more prominent. This is exactly the bandwagon that we are riding here. We have an internal version of the semantic specifications, and we are like advocating for them. Now with OpenTelemetry entering the scene, this is the next version of metrics and tracing products we're currently rolling out. Those will be more baked in than before. So you have like auto-completion helpers or constants that allow you to easily access those attributes. And you also have more auto-instrumentations that you have for standardized services, internal and external services, just automatic standard tracing instrumentation that then has the correct attributes. I wouldn't still say that it's solved. I think there's still a lot of Wild West going on, but we kind of approach it from a product perspective, one piece at a time. We want to have standardized infrastructure monitoring, standardized dashboards around it, standardized Kubernetes dashboards for the APIs, just understand the red metrics very well, and then standardized metrics for Postgres, for Redis. Also centralize the knowledge about operations of this kind of standard pieces that we piece together. And then observability and dashboards are kind of part of that observability package that we are trying to centrally provide.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned Lightstep's ability to scale to your workload and petabytes that are being sent over, et cetera.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, you and I have talked about this. Lightstep has, I mean, our history as a vendor really goes back to a lot of our time at Google developing their systems. And we have taken a lot of the lessons we learned in that process to build some stuff that I think is probably 10 to 100x more scalable than other things that are out there just fundamentally. And that ends up being translated over to what we can handle from a workload standpoint. But the data volume itself is only important if you can like take advantage of it in some way. And I think a lot of it comes down to like aggregate analysis. Like when you talk about tracing, I mean, I really think of it, it's observability. Lightstep has one observability product. We'll talk about metrics in a minute. Tracing is one of the data sources that we use for that. But a lot of what we've attempted to do, and I think have done in Zalando's case, is to take individual traces and show them as needed, but also do aggregate analysis to understand, performance bottlenecks and things like that, not just by looking at it case by case, but really looking at the sum total of how everything is fitting together. Is it fair to say that when Zalando's doing performance analysis to try and improve the user experience, that Lightstep is an important tool in that process, and that you're looking at those sorts of features as well?
I would say so, yeah. I know the Explorer features where you're really able to see what kind of a transaction or a specific span has as a latency profile. So it does provide this kind of observability. I would say it's really real-time focused. So you have the best observability into these things that are going on right now. My experience has been like, if I'm analyzing durations like a month or something like that, this currently not so well possible. But it certainly opens the door and it's the right approach. So everything that is related to latency, we really preach, use tracing for it, write this as long as at all possible before you take the next steps and put in logs and translation, or maybe a histogram, but maybe we'll have that in the future as well. So, but for us, it's the first thing. And I would say 90% of the performance analysis use cases are usually well served by that technology.
Yeah, cool. So I think we've talked a bunch about tracing. I think one of the things that I really want to cover in this chat, and I'd like to transition over to, is metrics. So Lightstep did start life doing tracing, but our vision has always been to do observability, and tracing is an aspect of that. We released pretty fully fledged metrics solution a little over a year ago. Heinrich, maybe you can talk about the problem that you had to solve. If you want, you and I have chatted privately about this. I'm happy if you want to talk about your skepticism going in, and then how things have gone. And if you talk about scale along the way, that would be useful too.
Yeah, let's do that. So I think for this conversation, a little bit of context is good to see where we were standing and what our problems were. So this story is from 2021, so it's relatively recent. We were still in 2020 operating our own time series backend, our own like metrics solution. The Z1 thing, it's open source. If you want to have a look at it, it's completely great because it's super flexible, but it's also completely problematic because it's so flexible. So it's heavily used, and it's churning out like between 50 and 100 or 30 and 100 million metrics every minute. So it's a big beast. And it has Cassandra. It had a Cassandra-based time series storage backend, KarisDB, open source time series database. We forked that to make it suitable for our workload. And we had a lot of expertise in running it, but it was also very painful. There were like dashboards were always slow. We couldn't never load more than a day because it was just like taking too long. And we had a bunch of big outages. Like the most famous one is the 2018 Cyberweek outage, our most important sales event, like Friday, like 8-hour Z1 outage. It was a complete nightmare. I've heard so many stories about that. And the problem was Cassandra. I mean, the read IOPS didn't suffice, couldn't keep up with the load. There were some query patterns on that day that were really, really hitting us badly. And the moment the platform scaled, it just hit a wall, and we couldn't resurrect it for 8 grueling hours. So it was super major, and it led to a very, very interesting and long introspection exercise about how well do we understand this beast, and how well can we operate it the next year. And this take a long time, but the ultimate decision was we want to get rid of the storage. I think the storage is most of the time the most problematic bit of any metric system. And this was right the time when I arrived in the company, and I have just like worked for a company for 5 years where I had like tons of experience how to build the systems. And Syconos had done that multiple times, really large, highly cost efficient way of operating this large bits. And I had seen like the generations of problem solving and performance tuning you're putting in such a system over the years. And then we had this contender in our POC, Lightstep, as one of the technologies we were looking at. And Lightstep at the time, a brand new product. It wasn't even GA, it was beta. And we were like, okay, let's try that. And I was like, I thought the idea of including this was already a little bit insane, because I didn't think this was at all possible to do. And then, I mean, we did a POC with a bunch of vendors to see where we stand. And for us, there was a strategic advantage that Lightstep had, because we already had the tracing product integrated, and we believe that there's a kind of synergy between the metrics and the tracing, and you can unlock a lot of analytics by having both telemetry types unified. It's not our idea, it's actually something that we learned from you, but we back in the day were or are still convinced that this is the right path forward. So the POC, what we really try to do is scan Lightstep metrics, brand new, like just not even a year, handle this workload, which I thought was pretty good workload. 100 million metrics, 300 RPS on the read side. We have like 400 dashboards open all the time in our warehouses, which do actually quite some load on the time series database. And also, we wanted to have it cost efficiently. We didn't want to break the bank with this system either. So I was like super surprised to learn that Lightstep metrics was able to live up to that. The one thing I will give you is that the query load wasn't super complex. We had back in the day, it was a very old system which had very little like accessibility. So that was, I think, fortunate. But we managed to get all the query patterns mapped. We managed to get the performance vastly improved, and we completely solved our operational problems with our metrics platform. There are like little hiccups now and then, nothing major. Last Cyberweek was a complete breeze. Before, we were really spending months of preparing the Cassandra cluster to make sure it's up to the task. We understand the workload. We have like backup plans for all the dashboards. If they go bad, then we have something else. There was like much less stress, a lot less stress on the team, and we could skip all this preparation, and there were very little problems. Also on the rollout, it was very smooth. Did some like double writing and fallback stuff, so to make it completely transparent. And the worst thing was like 2 or 3 dashboards, or maybe tens of them, which had like zigzags in it, because the details of the metrics data structures that you're using do not one-to-one map to the old ones. So you kind of have aggregation artifacts one there and then there. But yeah, I was very impressed to see that it's able to stand up to that and meet the bar. And so we are on like for a good year now, happy Lightstep metrics customers, and yeah, looking forward to continuing the journey and also leveraging more and more of that kind of synergies. I think there's still a lot to discover and how to like exploit that two telemetry pillars that are there in the same system.
Yeah, thank you. And can you talk a bit about Cyberweek? Just like what is the load profile of Cyberweek in terms of, you know, what's a normal week versus Cyberweek, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so it's a major sales event for us. So commercially, it's super relevant. It's so relevant that our management stresses out about preparing all systems for Cyberweek. There's a major project that is multi-month, and SRE is heavily involved with. So basically, the second half of the year is always our Cyberweek project, where all SREs are all over the place trying to review operational readiness and scrutinize systems and uncover risks. So it's also great for SRE because it gives you the presence and the mandate to do and change things, but it's commercially extremely important. And scaling wise, it varies very much from system to system, but we have like 10x scale to 40x scale in some of the systems. So it's very significant. And yeah, if you are especially running systems for the first year during Cyberweek, you are never really sure how they will stand up to that kind of pattern. So exercises like load testing are absolutely critical to discover the bottlenecks. And yeah, we also generate a ton of traces in that period, like up to 70 million spans a second. So also a factor 10. And to be fair, we had seen very little scaling problems on the Lightstep side. I think you're probably also watching this event a little bit internally and seeing what kind of systems you need to deploy in order to handle it smoothly. But so far, that has been going quite well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's Lightstep is aware of Cyberweek for sure, and we want to make sure Zalando has this, like all of our customers, has a successful experience. But it's never been an issue from a skilling standpoint for us per se. There's some elasticity that we have in the system, right, and it can accommodate that. But I think what I noticed about it is just that we have noticed that Zalando's workload changes really dramatically in that week, and that's pretty obvious just looking at various graphs and stuff like that. And I think do you remember what your quote was last year? I mean, last year was the first year that we did Cyberweek together, where it was this all in on Lightstep, for both the fancy tracing observability stuff, but also just core monitoring, right? Like we were sort of the first port of call for that. And do you remember, I think I have it written down somewhere, what your overall affect was about that?
I don't remember the details, but I think I was happy about not operating Cassandra at this point.
You said it was very boring in a good way. I think.
Yeah, exactly. It was largely a non-event. And I mean, when I joined, everybody was Cyberweek. It's going to be so exciting. We'll have all that incidents and we can do firefighting and stay up all nights to get this done. And they had this 2018 experience, which was really also a great team building exercise. If you are sitting there with the CEO behind your back and saying, hey, when are you thinking you're going to have that Zmon thingy up again? We like our dashboards during Cyberweek. How is that going?
Yeah.
So it was always an exciting time for the SRE team. And the Cyberweeks that I've seen have been extremely boring to a degree that I spent like hours looking for jokes on the internet just to entertain the situation room a little bit.
So the marketing message here is you can spend your days looking for jokes on the internet if you buy Lightstep. Is that the maybe not?
Yeah, you can take that away if you like.
There's a serious question. How many folks are on Zalando's SRE teams from Craig McLean?
Around 30.
30. Okay.
I mean, we have like the interesting bit is also about the SRE. What is SRE at Zalando? It's a different question, but it's relevant in that case because we don't have like a large SRE organization who's doing the on-call actually for the services. The developers and the teams are on call, and we have a centralized SRE team or SRE department, which is providing the tooling around it. Traditionally, it had consulting capabilities where they would have a team and go out. And this has been like transitioning a little bit more. We have now embedded teams in 2 or 3 business units, which are more closer to the customer. And we are still trying to figure out the right engagement model, how we are seeing that. Is this going to be just an example, or is that a model that may be something we need to do or should do in the future? It's not really clear, but it's not that the SRE department at Zalando is actually all the Zalando SREs. That they're much more like SRE kind of engineers around Zalando. Just be at the central team. It's around 30.
Cool. So I'm going to prompt folks for other questions in the chat. I'm going to make sure that we cover a couple of other things. I realize I think we build this as a 30-minute webinar and we're way over, but I'm enjoying the conversation and people have mostly stayed on, so I'm going to keep on rolling with it. There was a pretty interesting question from Sasha Stadelman. How do you correlate thread ID from the span to CPU profiling, or do you do that? Do you do CPU profiling? I actually don't know the answer to that. I mean, what do you all do for kind of throughput level CPU profiling? Does that connect into the spans at all?
Yeah, I wish it was. So I think there's a ton of performance gains still to be leveraged across Zalando, and I don't think we are particularly good at that. I think there are some products, particularly around Postgres, where we understand the load profile very well and have spent a lot of time understanding like the actual runtime profile. Maybe there are other like high throughput systems, like we have a proxy service, which is also extremely efficient. Where we did that exercises. This is not the norm throughout Zalando. We are a PHP shop when we began. Then we were a Java Postgres kind of monolith thing, and now we are like a Wild West microserver thing. But we are still like in the business of selling socks. So we are relatively high up the stack, and our core competence is really relatively high in the application layer. And I wish we had more of that great performance problems where it's like, yes, we need to like shave some microseconds off thread locality. Let's get rid of that context switches, make that memory access really fast. We don't have that, or it's not economical for us yet to investigate that kind of a level of engineer for that level of performance. I think there is like large benefits when it comes to cost reduction of the general footprint that we want to look at in the near future. But our engineers are currently not like trained in a way that they would look at thread IDs and correlate that to CPU profiles. So we would have to like cater this to them and say, this is your flame graph. Do you really think this is a good flame graph? Here is how a good flame graph would look like. And here's how log contention looks like, and here's how we can service this to you and help you make your applications more efficient. It's a thing that yeah, I would really like to see, but it's I think 2 steps away from where we currently are.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, not about Zalando, but just as a practitioner myself, that that CPU profiling, by and large, I mean, exceptions, is generally like a throughput game. You're trying to improve throughput and efficiency. And if you're trying to actually make things faster in a microservice application, it's almost always going to be due to like the calling patterns over networks. And I mean, when you start talking, I mean, a network call is order of, milliseconds or tens of milliseconds, versus anything happening on a local machine is going to be like nanoseconds or microseconds. So you have this like, it's sometimes like 6 orders of magnitude difference there. So if you're making network calls on the critical path, that's going to be your bottleneck. And so for latency, right? So it's very rare to use CPU profiling to do latency analysis. And most shops that are doing microservices are on the revenue side of their business, where it's probably more important to focus on innovating quickly than to focus on throughput efficiency. So only when things are like super scaled out backends where you actually do start seeing the level of like replication inside these pods that would warrant like throughput improvements for efficiency, like only there, or I guess just in shops where people are super sophisticated and care a lot about cost across the board, are people going to invest in heavily in that stuff. But at some point, we're going to cross the line where that becomes necessary in a more systematic way. And I'm frankly pretty excited about it. I think that there's a lack of integration right now between CPU level profiling and distributed tracing. Doing that integration will allow us to profile just on the critical path and things like that, which is going to be amazing. But I think the network is still dominating that, and that brings you right back to tracing, actually. I hope I'm just editorializing, but Craig asked a question: what was the hardest part about getting adoption from the development teams and moving away from this Wild West that you described, Heinrich? I mean, I don't know how much you were, how involved you were in that, but I'm curious if you can share anything.
We are still in the Wild West, but we tamed it a little bit, I would say. And that process was with a sharp knife. And it was interesting to see how well executed it was. So basically, we have this group of engineers, principal engineers, which form a community, which are responsible for the technical decision making in the company. It's not the CTO that makes technical decisions, but it's like experts, domain experts, and that are trying to organize in a community. It's sometimes more successful, sometimes less. But in that case, we had a big project around, like we also have a tech radar. So there's like already a longer term project around standardizing technology, and at least like raising awareness for where we have operational expertise or software experts for help building and working with those libraries and technologies. So there was a project group which basically set out to specify guidelines for developing code. And there was a blog post that dropped, which was basically saying, these are the rules. You're no longer writing Clojure. You're no longer writing that. There are no exceptions. And every new application has to conform. So there was a lot of discussion and outcry saying, but it died down also because it was not a single person doing that decision, but it was really a distributed team that had backing from all the departments that was making that decision. And it was harsh, but it also simplified our life as central functions a lot. Because now it's building this observability SDKs, which are basically a distribution of OpenTelemetry. You have to do that for every language. So you have to know all the languages. And just having like a little bit, like it's only 5 now. It's not like 15. We don't have Rust. We don't have C. We don't have C++. So that's, it's also sad, but it's also very important to know where to focus the energy and allowing you to leverage the synergies. So I would still say we have a relative Wild West. I mean, there are a lot of different applications you can build if you're just using Python, but it has become more technologically standardized. We're also trying to dial down just naming things. Back in the days, everybody could just choose a completely arbitrary team name. So yesterday I figured out we still have a team called Nobody. So nobody cares is kind of the slogan, which is funny, but it's also terrible because nobody knows what the Nobody team is doing. And so now our teams are called logging and like application insights or telemetry infrastructure. Yeah. Kind of a little bit better.
There's a question in the chat is whether Zalando has a dedicated observability team, like within SRE or outside of SRE, and how does that work?
Yeah, we have a department, SRE, which is like primarily a tooling provider, I would say. So we operate the telemetry tools, and we have currently, I would say, 3 teams dedicated to like tooling in the narrow sense. We actually split it. Before we had like metrics, logging, and then tracing was part of the metrics. So it was split by column. And now we sliced it the other way. We have a application insights team and a telemetry infrastructure team, which are cross telemetry types. So application infrastructure is everything that is close to the builders, so internal customers. So it's like Grafana dashboards, tracing libraries, and infrastructure is more vendor relations, telemetry backbone, data pipes, this kind of thing. And we have alerting and incident management teams that are part of that kind of SRE platform that we provide.
Yeah. So I realize we're going to run out of time as I have so much more to ask you. I do want to get to more like the future and things like that. I mean, I'm curious, you know, what are you excited about in the future for observability at Zalando and otherwise?
Yeah, it's a broad question. It's a lot of it is just surviving and
like aim high, Heinrich.
Yeah. I think there is still a lot to do when it comes to SLO and analytics. I think this is a general pattern that I have struggled with at my Syconis days always a little bit, to detect when actually there are failures. So you have all that streams, you have all that data, and at which point is it really a customer-facing issue? And you cannot distinguish between anomalies and between failures if you don't have anything like that it is telling you this really concisely. And with the advent of SLOs, and like they are like a lot of them are available to us, you have a really clear signal. You know when something is wrong, and you have then the question is much easier. So it's not figuring out if something is wrong. This is the SLO it's doing that, and then you have the problem to figure out what's going wrong and where's actually the problem. And I think the adaptive paging tag that I talked before is like one of the things that exploiting that kind of pattern. So you have a strong signal trigger on the one side and then an analytics task to figure out what's going on. I think that will be something that can be really helpful from a operational perspective, just helping people to direct attention. And you have a change detection feature, which is kind of going in a similar direction. You're doing some innovation with regards to also SLO integration I'm hearing. So this is a thing that I think will be high business value, and if it and possible. Before we had all this AI ops talk, and a lot of things was very unconcrete. But with SLOs in the mix, I think we have a real chance to do some more automation that is actually effective and possible to get into the hands of people.
I'm going to butcher this pronunciation. I'm so sorry, but Jean Brice maybe asked in chat, have you applied SLOs to groups of systems as opposed to single services? Apologies for my French. It's terrible.
Yeah, so that's another quarter an hour that I can spend talking about this problem. This is a great question. And there's a colleague of mine, Pedro Alves, will talk about exactly this at the upcoming SLOconf. So I invite you to look at that, but I can give you the 5-minute version. So we actually tried that to have SLOs on all 2,000 or 10,000 services, which is then just a very, very large amount of reports you're generating that nobody reads and has problems to tune. So I think there are possibly multiple solutions, but one that worked well for our kind of size is to root SLOs in what we call critical business operations, which are rooted in the user experience, so the shop. So if you look at the shop side, you have certain like critical, we call them operations that the user should be able to perform. View the catalog, add an item to the cart, pay, or like remove an item from the cart. And those are like these critical bits of functionality that we seek to provide. And so you have a list of those in a like internal tool, and you have SLOs on that kind of functions. So 99.9%, 95%, everybody click to, if it's click to add to cart, it should actually work. So that's the SLO. SLO is not, we don't have a cart service, it's actually 10 services, and we don't have, like maybe we have SLOs on them, but they are not so important. Important is that the user experience is protected. And then the question is about ownership. So you now have like 10 teams that are behind that single operation, add to cart. So who should own it? And actually none of them can own this thing. It's larger than them. It's owned by the director. It goes up the chain as high as it goes to the level that can protect that SLO. And the director then has to make sure that this SLO is met and direct the priorities in the team in a way that they are they are providing the reliability that is needed and kind of figure out the interdependencies. So maybe there's one service which is a common dependency which needs to be much more reliable. And a key piece in that puzzle, how to protect the SLO, I mean, not on a managerial pace, but also on an incident and operational pace, is the adaptive paging technology that I talked about, I think 3 times now. But this allows you to page any team that's behind it. So you have one alerting rule you set up and you can alert 10 teams by it, which is convenient and then allows you to protect the SLO effectively on that level.
Cool. I think we should probably wrap up. I wanted to thank you so much, Heinrich. I've gotten a bunch of chats from people who really enjoyed the session. I certainly have. Is there any kind of closing words that you want to share on your side, just to wrap things up?
Maybe thank you. I also enjoyed this very much. Looking forward to hearing more from you and being in touch, and also looking forward to the next conferences where we can also see our audience and interact with more people. Definitely looking forward for SRECon, for example, this year.
Yeah, and I will say it's been amazing to work with Zalando and to work with you for many years now, and it's just it's like a really fun customer to support. You guys do something that touches a lot of people, and you do it really well. So I appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for joining. Have a good rest of your day or evening. Yeah.
Bye-bye, everyone.